I'd like to ask you a little bit about multiculturalism and women. Australia is a very multicultural place. It's certainly not reflected in our parliaments or in our governing systems. When you look at the makeup of who's in power and who has leadership. Nevertheless, multiculturalism is complex when we talk about gender, and I know you've spoken about this at great length and certainly done a great deal of work in this area. Can you explain what is the tension between women culture and multiculturalism?
I think there's a tension in contexts where people take multiculturalism to mean, in a multicultural society, we must ensure that each of the constituent cultures is able to sustain itself and retain its kind of, its core cultural practices and beliefs. If you think of multiculturalism as like that, which I have to say very few people do, but if you think of it as like that, then potentially what you're doing is adopting a policy in which what are defined as the core practices of a culture often turn out to be very disadvantageous to women. I mean, if you set up, in any situation, if you were to say, what are the core kind of practices of Australian culture, whatever Australian culture is, if you looked at kind of a history of Australian culture, you would find so many practices which are disadvantageous to women. So if you had a politics that was about sustaining cultural practices, that's potentially a problem. So that's where there's a kind of tension between versions of multiculturalism and the interests of women or feminism. Multiculturalism understood as we are multicultural societies, and what that means is that we have to recognize that diversity and not simply impose one culture on all the other cultures. That kind of multiculturalism absolutely ought to be compatible with feminism.
Well, what is the role, though, of feminism and feminists when confronted with what is referred to as cultural practices or traditional practices or customs that some feminists might find abhorrent?
The most useful thing is to work with those organisations of women within the various cultural groups who are campaigning against practices that they find problematic for women. You'd never find a kind of context in which there isn't some kind of self-organisation of women, which is already challenging these things. Actually, myself, I think it's problematic to call these cultural practices, because when you use the term cultural practice, you give the impression that these are the norm within particular cultural groups, where forced marriage is not a cultural practice in the sense of being a norm that everyone in a particular cultural group would say, oh yes, what we do around here is forced marriage. You might have a norm of arranged marriage, which then in particular situations ends up as young people being forced into marriage. But you never get kind of a culture which said, our practice is to force people into marriage. That's not the reality. So I think one has to be quite careful about using the notion of cultural practices.
I'm just concerned, though, that there's a certain amount of cultural relativism that goes on here when we have a feminist argument about what's okay and what's not. And at what point can I intervene, should I intervene, or is it not my business?
Well, questions about intervention are, I think, pragmatic policy questions. There's always a kind of issue if you're devising policy about to what extent one does something like introduce a legislative ban, to what extent one works through education, to what extent one works through activist groups within different communities. So there are very practical policy questions about intervention. Those are I think the key important questions about intervention. In terms of whether it is legitimate to have intervention against something which puts women at a disadvantage or which causes harm, again, there will be issues about whether you are imposing a particular notion of disadvantage that is your notion rather than something that would be more widely shared. So you do have to think about these issues. And I think one has to be really careful about jumping in with a kind of a preconceived idea. I think some of the politics in contemporary Europe, which is around banning women from wearing full-body covering in the street, to me it's just astonishingly illiberal. When certain forms of very restrictive clothing are prescribed for women, whereas men don't have to wear the same kind of restrictive clothing. It seems to me there is clearly an issue there. But, you have to actually also recognise that people are agents and have choices and make choices for themselves. It's a much more complex field than is commonly recognised, I think, in some of the kind of the sort of media or popular representations.